The mafia boss ripped the tape from her mouth, then saw his brother's wedding ring on the floor. The rain in Greybridge did not wash things clean. It only slicked the cobblestones with oil and forced the city's filth into the gutters where it stagnated, waiting for the sun that rarely seemed to shine on this side of the coast. Inside the derelict warehouse on the eastern edge of the shipyard, the sound of the downpour was a deafening drumbeat against the corrugated metal roof. It was a rhythmic, relentless noise that usually helped Marco DeLuca think, but tonight, his mind was a tangle of sharp edges and darker premonitions. Marco stood in the center of the vast, empty space, his polished dress shoes resting on concrete, stained by decades of industrial grease. He was a man composed of hard lines and expensive tailoring, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than the warehouse was worth. At 35, he carried the weight of the DeLuca family legacy on shoulders that had grown broad from bearing burdens that would crush lesser men. He watched the rusted bay doors roll upward with a screech of protesting metal. Two of his men, heavy-set enforcers named Luca and Sal, dragged a figure between them. The person was hooded with a rough burlap sack and bound at the wrists with thick plastic zip ties. They moved with the casual roughness of men who had done this 1,000 times, hauling the captive toward the single wooden chair placed precisely under the glare of a hanging halogen bulb. "Sit her down," Marco said, his voice low but carrying effortlessly over the sound of the rain. They shoved the woman into the chair. She did not whimper, she did not beg. Instead, as soon as her weight settled, she kicked out, her boot connecting solidly with Sal's shin. The enforcer grunted and raised a hand to strike her, but Marco cut the air with a sharp command. Enough. Sal froze, lowering his hand slowly. Stepping back into the shadows, Marco approached the chair. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and deliberate. He circled the woman, observing the way her chest heaved with exertion rather than panic. He noted the red abrasions on her wrists where she had clearly spent the entire ride over, fighting the restraints. Most witnesses, when snatched off the street to prevent them from testifying, arrived in a state of hysterical collapse. They pleaded, they cried, they offered money they did not have. This woman was vibrating with rage. Marco stopped in front of her. He reached out, his leather gloves creaking softly as he gripped the coarse fabric of the hood. With a single, fluid motion, he yanked it off. Heavy, dark hair tumbled down, obscuring her face for a moment before she tossed her head back. Her eyes were green, piercing and bright, blazing with a fury that took Marco momentarily off guard. A strip of silver duct tape covered her mouth, sealing her silence. But the noise she made in her throat was a growl of defiance. He studied her. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and a bruise blooming on her temple where his men must have handled her too roughly during the extraction. She did not look like the accountant the Santoro cartel had supposedly flipped. She looked like a woman who would burn the world down if given a match. Marco leaned in, his face inches from hers. He smelled rain and a faint, sweet trace of vanilla perfume that seemed out of place in the damp rot of the warehouse. He reached for the edge of the tape at the corner of her mouth. "Do not scream," Marco warned quietly. "No one can hear you above the rain anyway." He ripped the tape from her mouth in one quick tear. The woman lurched forward, coughing and gasping for air, her lungs fighting to reclaim their rhythm. Marco waited, expecting the pleas to start. He expected the begging. "You morons." She spat, her voice raspy but loud. "You grabbed the wrong person." Marco raised an eyebrow, stepping back slightly. "Everyone says that. I am not a witness," she shouted, straining against the zip ties until her knuckles turned white. "I do not know who you people are, and I do not know why I am here. I was walking to my car. That is it. You have made a mistake, a massive mistake." Marco stared at her cold expression. He had an instinct for lies. He had built an empire on discerning truth from deception in the blink of an eye. The fear in her eyes was there, certainly, buried deep, but it was eclipsed by a righteous indignation that felt authentic. If she was a plant sent by the Santoro cartel to infiltrate his operation, she was the best actress he had ever seen. "Check her pockets again," Marco ordered Sal, never taking his eyes off the woman. "I already checked them." "Boss," Sal muttered, "just a wallet, No ID, a set of keys. Check them again, Marco snapped. As Sal moved forward, the woman thrashed in the chair, kicking out again. Leave me alone! During the struggle, something small and metallic slipped from the pocket of her jeans. It hit the grimy concrete with a distinct, high-pitched ping that echoed in the brief silence between thunderclaps. It rolled in a wobbly circle before coming to rest near the toe of Marco's shoe. Marco looked down. The object was a ring, a man's ring. It was platinum, heavy and thick, with a simple yet brutalist design that caught the harsh light of the halogen bulb. Marco felt the blood drain from his face. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He knew that ring. He knew the weight of it, the specific luster of the metal. He had paid for it himself, 5 years ago, as a 25th birthday gift for the only person in the world he truly loved. He crouched down, ignoring the creak of his knees, and picked it up. The metal was cold against his palm. He turned it over to look at the inner band. There, engraved in a precise serif font, was a date, October 12th, their mother's birthday. The date Adrian had sworn he would turn his life around. The date Marco had given him this ring as a symbol of brotherhood and a promise of a future outside the family business. Marco stood up slowly. A dark, terrifying coldness settled in his chest. He looked at the ring, then at the woman. His vision narrowed until all he could see was her face and the platinum band in his hand. "Where did you get this?" Marco asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more threat than his shout ever could. The woman stopped struggling. She looked at the ring in his hand, and for the first time, genuine terror cracked her mask of anger. Her eyes widened. "Give that back to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I asked you where you got it." Marco roared, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "Did you steal this? Did you hurt him? Tell me right now, or I will forget that I am a gentleman." "I did not steal it," she screamed back, tears suddenly springing to her eyes. "It belongs to my husband." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Marco stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to process the words she had just thrown at him. "Your husband," Marco repeated flatly. "Yes," Claire cried out, her breathing shallow and fast. "It fell out of my pocket. I carry it because he is missing. He's been missing for 3 weeks." Marco took a step closer, his hand clenching around the ring so tightly the metal dug into his skin. "What is your husband's name?" She hesitated, looking at the men in the shadows, then back at Marco's face, searching for something. Mercy, perhaps, or recognition. "Adrian," she whispered. "Adrian DeLuca." The name hit Marco like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. Adrian, his little brother. The boy he had protected from their father's belt. The young man he had shielded from the darkest parts of the business. The man who had vanished 3 weeks ago without a trace. "Adrian is not married," Marco said, then his voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of denial and rage. "He is," she insisted, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "We have been married for 2 years. He did not tell anyone. He said it had to be a secret. He said it was dangerous." Marco looked at the ring again. October 12th. It wasn't just a birthday. If they had been married 2 years, that date would have been around the time Adrian started disappearing for days at a time, claiming he was scouting legitimate real estate investments in the city. "Get out," Marco said to his men. "Boss?" Sal asked, confused. "Get out," Marco yelled, spinning on his heel. "Leave us. Now, guard the door from the outside. If anyone comes within 100 yards of this building, kill them." The 2 enforcers did not hesitate. They scrambled for the exit, the heavy metal door clanging shut behind them, leaving Marco alone with the woman who claimed to be his brother's secret wife. Marco paced the small circle of light, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like a caged animal. Adrian was married for 2 years, and he had said nothing? The betrayal tasted like ash in Marco's mouth. He had raised Adrian, he had kept him clean, or at least he thought he had. He stopped pacing and turned to face her. Her name was Claire. He knew that now because she had shouted it at Sal earlier, though he hadn't listened. Claire Hart. No. Claire DeLuca. "Tell me everything," Marco commanded, "and do not lie to me. Claire, I will know." Claire swallowed hard, her throat moving visibly. She looked exhausted, her earlier fire dampened by the shock of the situation. He was afraid. She began, her voice shaking. "He told me his family was complicated. He said his brother was a powerful man who would not understand. He wanted to get out. He wanted us to leave Greybridge." Marco felt a sharp pang of guilt pierce through his anger. Adrian wanted out. That was the one thing Marco had always wanted for him too. But the life was like quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper it pulled you in. 3 weeks ago, Claire continued, sniffing back tears, he got a phone call. He became very pale. He told me he had to go to a meeting. He said it was the meeting that would end it all, that after this, we would be free. He left his ring on the nightstand. He said he did not want to taint it with where he was going. She looked up at Marco, her eyes pleading. "He never came back. I have been looking for him. I went to the police, but they did not help. Then people started following me. Cars parked outside my apartment, phone calls where no one spoke, and then tonight, your men grabbed me." Marco listened, absorbing every word. The timeline matched. 3 weeks ago, Adrian had missed Sunday dinner. Marco had assumed he was with a woman, but when days turned into a week, Marco had started his own quiet search. He had assumed the Santoro cartel had taken him, or that Adrian had run off on a bender. But this was different. If Adrian had gone to a meeting to end it all, that sounded like a deal. A deal with the feds, or a deal with the Santoros? Marco stepped closer to her, invading her space. He needed to see her eyes. He needed to be close enough to smell the fear or the deceit on her skin. "You are telling me," Marco said softly, leaning down until his face was level with hers, "that my brother, a man who told me everything, hid a wife for 2 years, and that he walked into a trap to save you? I am telling you the truth," Claire whispered. Marco studied her face. He looked for the twitch of a lie, the shift of a gaze. He saw only desperation and a grief that mirrored his own. He was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his chin. For a moment, the anger receded, replaced by a strange, confusing pull. She was beautiful. Yes, but it was more than that. She was Adrian's. She was family, and she was terrified. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her, an instinct that warred violently with his suspicion. The air between them grew heavy, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the interrogation. Her lips were parted slightly, trembling. Marco felt a heat rise up the back of his neck. He was staring at her mouth. He realized with a jolt that he wanted to touch her, not to hurt her, but to reassure her. The thought repulsed him. This was his brother's wife. He pulled back abruptly, straightening his spine and putting distance between them. The ring was still clenched in his fist, digging into his palm, a painful anchor to reality. "If what you say is true," Marco said, his voice rough, "then you are in terrible danger. If Adrian is missing and people are following you, it means someone knows who you are. And if my men found you, the Santoros can find you too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the roll of silver tape. Claire's eyes widened, and she flinched, pressing herself back against the chair. "No, please," she begged. "I have to," Marco said, his tone clipped. "I cannot walk you out of here right now. I need to verify your story. If you are lying, Claire, you will wish you had never met Adrian, but if you are telling the truth..." He trailed off. He tore a strip of tape, shorter this time. He stepped forward and placed it over her mouth. He was gentle, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against her cheek. Her skin was soft, cold from the rain. "I will be back," he promised. He turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. He did not look back at her. He couldn't. Marco burst through the metal door and out into the stormy night. The rain hit him instantly, soaking his suit, but he didn't feel it. He walked over to where his black sedan was parked, the engine idling, the window rolled down. revealing the scarred, stony face of Rocco, his second in command and the only man Marco trusted with his life. "Rocco," Marco said, leaning into the window, water dripping from his hair. "Boss, the girl?" Rocco asked. "She stays." Marco said, "Put 2 men on the door. No one goes in, no one goes out, not even to use the bathroom." "Understood," Rocco said, sensing the shift in Marco's mood. "What is the play?" Marco opened his hand, revealing the platinum ring sitting in his wet palm. "This is Adrian's," Marco said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She says she is his wife. She says he went to a meeting 3 weeks ago to end it all and never came back." Rocco's eyes widened slightly. That was the only sign of surprise he ever showed. "Married, Adrian? Find out if it is true," Marco ordered, his eyes hard as flint. "Dig into the marriage records, check the county clerk, check everywhere, and Rocco. Find out who Adrian met 3 weeks ago. I want a name." "And if he is dead?" Rocco asked quietly. Marco closed his fist over the ring again, squeezing until his knuckles turned white. "If he is dead," Marco said, his voice dropping to a growl that matched the thunder overhead. "Then someone used his wife and his ring to send a message, and I am going to write them a reply in blood." Marco opened the back door of the car and slid in. "Go," as the car peeled away from the warehouse, splashing through the deep puddles. Marco stared out at the blurring city lights. He rubbed his thumb over the engraving on the ring. October 12th. He would find the truth. And God help anyone who had touched his brother, or his brother's wife. Dawn broke over Graybridge like a bruise, turning the sky a mottled purple and gray. Marco DeLuca had not slept. He sat in the leather chair of his study in the family estate, holding the platinum ring between his thumb and forefinger. The metal had warmed to his body temperature, losing the cold indifference it had possessed on the warehouse floor. But the engraving inside remained sharp and accusatory. October 12th. He had spent the last 6 hours making phone calls that no one wanted to receive. He had woken judges, city clerks, and low-level informants, demanding access to marriage records that were supposed to be sealed or non-existent. At 4 a.m, the confirmation had come through a terrified clerk in a neighboring county, Adrian DeLuca and Claire Hart. Married 2 years ago in a civil ceremony with no witnesses other than the officiant. It was true. Marco stood up, his joints popping from the long stillness. He slid the ring into his breast pocket, where it sat heavy against his heart. He had a job to do. He drove back to the warehouse alone. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and dripping, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt and impending violence. When he rolled up the heavy bay door, he found Claire exactly where he had left her. She was slumped in the chair, exhausted, her head hanging low. But as soon as his footsteps echoed on the concrete, she snapped upright. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but the fire was still there. Marco stopped in front of her. He did not speak immediately. He pulled a serrated knife from his belt. Claire flinched, her breath hitching in a sharp gasp, but Marco ignored her fear. He moved behind her and sliced through the plastic zip ties with a single, precise motion. She surged forward as her hands came free, rubbing her wrists where the plastic had bitten into the skin. She turned to look at him, confusion warring with relief on her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse from thirst. Marco sheathed the knife. He looked at her, his face a mask of stone that gave nothing away. "Because you are my brother's wife," Marco said. The words tasted strange on his tongue. He grabbed her upper arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and pulled her toward the exit. She stumbled, her legs stiff from hours of confinement, but he steadied her without slowing his pace. "Do not think this makes us friends," Marco added, his tone clipped and broadcasting danger. "You are a loose end, Claire. And until I find Adrian, you are my responsibility. That is not a kindness. It is a burden." He shoved her into the passenger seat of his sedan and locked the doors. As he drove them away from the industrial district and into the waking city, the silence in the car was thick enough to choke on. Claire watched the streets pass by, her hand clutching the door handle, while Marco watched the mirrors, checking for a tail. He took her to a safe house on the north side of Graybridge, a neighborhood of brick row houses and fading dreams. The building was an old speakeasy that had been converted into a dive bar called the Rusty Anchor. It had been closed for 3 years, a front Marco kept for emergencies. They entered through the back alley, Marco keying in a code on a reinforced steel door, upstairs. The apartment was small. It consisted of a single open room with a kitchenette, a worn leather couch, and a bedroom separated only by a thin wall. The air smelled of stale dust and lemon polish. Marco locked the door behind them, throwing 3 separate deadbolts. "Stay away from the windows," Marco ordered, tossing his keys onto the scarred wooden counter. Claire stood in the center of the room, looking around at the cramped space. It was suffocating. The walls seemed to lean in, forcing a proximity to the man who had kidnapped her that made her skin prickle. "I need a phone," Claire said, turning to face him. I need to see if he has tried to reach me." Marco walked to the kitchenette and started a pot of coffee. He moved with a domestic efficiency that looked jarring in his expensive suit. "Your phone is gone," Marco said without looking at her. "And if Adrian tries to reach you, he will not do it on a traceable line. If he is alive." Claire flinched as if he had slapped her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her look smaller. "He is alive," she stated firmly. Marco turned, the coffee machine gurgling behind him. He watched her. Really watched her, for the first time in the daylight. She looked like a wreck, hair tangled, clothes wrinkled, bruises forming on her wrists, but she held herself with a dignity that reminded him painfully of Adrian. Adrian had always been the stubborn one. He poured 2 mugs of black coffee and slid one across the counter toward her. "Drink," he commanded. "I do not want it," she said. "Drink it," Marco repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "You are running on adrenaline. When it crashes, you will collapse. I cannot carry you." Claire glared at him, then stepped forward and took the mug. She held it with both hands, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. She took a sip, grimacing at the bitterness, but she did not put it down. Marco leaned his hip against the counter, crossing his arms. "So, Adrian, 2 years." Claire looked down into the dark liquid. He was the best man I ever knew." Marco let out a short, harsh laugh. "We are talking about the same Adrian? The one who stole a car when he was 15. The one who broke a man's jaw in a bar fight because he looked at him wrong." Claire looked up, her eyes flashing. "He was gentle. He used to read on the fire escape because he liked the light. He cooked dinner every Sunday. He hated violence. He told me he grew up in a war zone and he just wanted peace." Marco felt a muscle in his jaw jump. The image of Adrian cooking Sunday dinner felt like a hallucination. Sunday was the day the family counted the week's take. Sunday was business. He did not grow up in a war zone, Marco said coldly. He grew up in a fortress. I made sure of it. I took every beating our father ever tried to give him. I stood between him and the world so he could be soft, so he could read on fire escapes. Claire's expression faltered. She saw the flash of pain in Marco's eyes before he masked it. "He told me about his brother," Claire said softly. "He said his brother was a shadow. He said he loved you, but you were part of the darkness he had to escape." The words cut deeper than Marco expected. He pushed off the counter, unable to stand still. He paced the small length of the kitchen, the room suddenly feeling far too small for the size of his emotions. He didn't know darkness. Marco growled. He only knew the shade I provided. Claire set the mug down with a sharp clack. "Stop it! Stop acting like you own him. You don't know the man he became. You only know the boy you tried to control, and maybe that is why he is missing. Maybe he was running from you just as much as he was running from the Santoros." The accusation hung in the air, vibrating with tension. Marco stopped pacing. He turned slowly to face her. The accusation that he was responsible for Adrian's disappearance, that his protection had actually been a cage, ignited a fuse deep in his chest. He stepped toward her. Claire tried to step back, but her lower back hit the edge of the counter. She was trapped. Marco moved in close, planting his hands on the counter on either side of her hips, boxing her in. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The air between them crackled, hot and volatile. "You think I did this?" Marco whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "You think I would touch a hair on his head? I have killed men for looking at him sideways. I have buried pieces of my own soul to keep his clean. I would die before I betrayed my brother." Claire looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was too close. She could smell the coffee on his breath, the expensive sandalwood of his cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of danger that clung to him like a second skin. But in this terrifying proximity, she saw something else. She saw a faint, jagged scar running from the corner of his mouth down to his chin, a remnant of violence she had not noticed before. She saw the fine lines of exhaustion fanning out from his eyes, lines etched by years of vigilance. And Marco, looking down at her, felt his anger collide with something unexpected. He saw the way her chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. He saw the stubborn tears that welled in her eyes, refusing to fall. She wasn't cowering. She was standing her ground, just like he would have. The heat of their anger was twisting, morphing into a different kind of intensity. It was magnetic. It was the raw, confused energy of two people who loved the same ghost and hated each other for it. Marco's gaze dropped to her lips, then snapped back to her eyes. He felt a sudden, insane urge to bridge the gap, to taste the defiance on her mouth. The thought horrified him. He pushed himself back from the counter abruptly, turning his back on her. "Get some rest," he muttered, his voice rough. "I have calls to make." Claire let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She sank onto the couch, her legs shaking, while Marco stood by the window, peering through the crack in the blinds, his silhouette tense and brooding against the gray light. Night fell over Graybridge, turning the city into a landscape of shadows and neon. The safe house was quiet. Marco had ordered pizza, which sat uneaten in its box on the coffee table. The tension from the morning had not dissipated. It had only thickened, filling the small room like gas waiting for a spark. Claire was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching Marco. He was cleaning a handgun at the small kitchen table. The rhythmic click-clack of metal parts the only sound in the room. "Do you think he is dead?" Claire asked into the silence. Marco didn't look up. "I don't know. But you feel it, don't you?" She pressed. "You feel like something is wrong. I always feel like something is wrong. Claire, it is how I stay alive." Crack. The sound was sharp, like a whip snapping, followed instantly by the shattering of glass. The window above the sink exploded inward. Marco didn't think. He didn't process the sound or the trajectory. He moved on pure instinct, honed by a lifetime of violence. "Down," he roared. He launched himself across the room, tackling Claire off the couch. They hit the floor hard, Marco taking the brunt of the impact on his shoulder and hip. He covered her body with his own, pressing her into the worn carpet as a second shot thudded into the wall where her head had been seconds before. Glass rained down on them, tinkling like perverse wind chimes. Marco's hand came up to cup the back of her head, shielding her from the debris. He was a heavy, solid weight on top of her, pinning her safely beneath him. "Stay down," he hissed into her ear. Claire was frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. She could feel Marco's heart hammering against her chest, a frantic rhythm that matched her own. She could feel the hard lines of his gun holstered at his side, the rough texture of his suit jacket against her cheek. Her fingers instinctively clutched the fabric of his shirt, gripping him as the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. For a long, suspended moment, the shooting stopped. They lay there, pressed together on the cold floor in the dark. Marco lifted his head slightly, checking the room, and then looked down at her. Their eyes locked, in the shadows. His gaze was intense, terrifying and electrified. There was no space between them. Her legs were tangled with his, the scent of him, gun oil, sweat, and that sandalwood cologne, filled her senses. It was an intimacy born of survival, but it sparked a confusing jolt of heat through her veins. For a second, she wasn't thinking about the shooter. She was thinking about the weight of him, the strength of the arm holding her head. Marco felt it too. He felt the softness of her beneath him, the way she fit against him. It was wrong. It was dangerous. He forced himself to roll away, dragging her with him as he scrambled behind the solid cover of the kitchen island. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands checking her arms and shoulders roughly. "No," Claire gasped. "I don't think so." Marco pulled his phone from his pocket, his face a mask of cold fury. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving the shattered window. "Rocco," he barked through gritted teeth. "We are burned. The safe house is compromised. Bring the armored SUV. Now." He hung up and looked at Claire. "Get your shoes on. We are moving." "Where?" Claire asked, her voice trembling as she scrambled to tie her laces. "To the only place I can trust," Marco said darkly. The ride to the city center was a blur of speed and paranoia. Marco drove with one hand on the wheel and the other on his weapon, constantly checking the mirrors. He didn't speak until they pulled into the underground garage of the Obsidian Tower, the tallest, most secure residential building in Graybridge. He led her into a private elevator that required a retinal scan to open. As they ascended 70 stories, Claire leaned against the mirrored wall, hugging herself. "My penthouse," Marco explained, seeing her expression. "Reinforced steel walls, bulletproof glass, private security detail in the lobby. No one gets in here unless I want them to." "It is a cage," Claire murmured. "A gilded cage." Marco looked at her, his eyes weary. "A cage keeps the tiger out." "Claire, whoever shot at us knew about the safe house. That location was known only to 3 people. Me, Rocco, and my brother." Claire looked up sharply. "You think Adrian told them?" "I think," Marco said, the elevator doors sliding open to reveal a sprawling, dimly lit apartment, "that someone close to me is leaking information, and until I find out who, this is the only place you are safe." The penthouse was beautiful, cold, and impersonal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering city, but the furniture looked like it had never been used. Marco secured the door and walked into the living room, shedding his jacket. He looked exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the heavy ache of the bruises he had sustained tackling her. Claire walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the platinum ring Marco had returned to her in the car. She had threaded it onto a thin gold chain she wore around her neck. She fastened the clasp, letting the heavy ring fall against her sternum. It sat there, a cold weight, resting just above her heart. Marco watched her from the shadows of the hallway. He saw her silhouette against the city lights, the way her hand lingered on the ring. He felt a profound sense of loneliness wash over him. He missed Adrian. He missed the brother he thought he knew. But as he watched Claire, he felt something else. A warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with brotherhood. He remembered the feeling of her body beneath his on the floor, the way she had clutched his shirt. He remembered the fire in her eyes in the kitchen. He walked into the room and sat on the opposite end of the massive velvet couch. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter and placed one on the table near her. Claire sat down, pulling her legs up, keeping distance between them. They sat in silence. 2 strangers bound by a missing man and a bullet-riddled window. Marco took a drink, the whiskey burning a path down his throat. He looked at Claire, at the ring resting on her chest. "We will find him," Marco said quietly. Claire looked at him. Her eyes were sad, but the anger was gone, replaced by a weary truce. "I know," she said. But as she looked at Marco, sitting there in the dim light, nursing his drink and his wounds, she wondered who they would be when they finally did. And she wondered, with a spike of guilt, why she felt safer in this gilded cage with the monster than she ever had in the freedom of the outside world. Marco watched her, torn between the ghost of his brother and the dangerous, growing warmth he felt for his brother's wife. He took another drink, wishing it could drown the confusion, but knowing, with a sinking feeling, that the trouble was only just beginning. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel suspended 70 stories above the streets of Graybridge. But to Marco DeLuca, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a command center for a war he was rapidly losing control of. For 3 days, the apartment hummed with a tension that was thick enough to taste. The air conditioning kept the rooms at a crisp, sterile temperature, a sharp contrast to the humid heat of the city below. But Marco could not cool the burning in his gut. He began a systematic, ruthless investigation that consumed every waking hour. He did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury for men who did not have missing brothers and potential traitors in their midst. Marco set up a temporary base of operations in his home office, a room dominated by dark mahogany and screens that flickered with data streams. He worked with the cold precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. He summoned his capos one by one, not to the penthouse, but to neutral locations across the city, questioning them with a terrifying quietness that unnerved them more than his shouting ever could. He traced Adrian's last known movements through credit card pings and traffic cameras. He called in favors from a contact in the federal database, a man whose gambling debts Marco had purchased years ago, forcing him to flag any chatter regarding a DeLuca informant, while Marco hunted. Claire existed in the periphery of his vision, a ghost haunting the modern halls of his high-rise. She paced. She moved from the living room window to the kitchen and back again, her reflection catching in the glass like a trapped bird. She felt suffocated by the luxury, the silk sheets in the guest room, the fully stocked refrigerator, the stunning view of the skyline. It all felt like a gilded cage. Yet, beneath the restlessness, Claire felt a confusing, undeniable sense of safety. When Marco was in the room, the terrifying uncertainty of the last few weeks receded. He was a force of nature, a wall of broad shoulders and grim determination that stood between her and the people who wanted her dead. It was a safety she had never felt with Adrian. Adrian's love had been frantic, hidden, and fearful. Marco's presence was solid. It was heavy. It was real. On the 4th evening, the silence broke. Marco was staring at a laptop screen at the dining table, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away a migraine. A folder on Adrian's recovered laptop was encrypted, a digital dead end that had stalled his progress for hours. "Let me try," Claire said. Marco looked up, startled. He had almost forgotten she was there, standing on the other side of the kitchen island with a mug of tea she had been nursing for an hour. "It is encrypted with military-grade software," Marco said, his voice raspy from disuse. "My tech guy is coming in the morning to brute force it." Adrian was not military, Claire said. Walking around the island, she moved with a newfound confidence, born of boredom and desperation. He was sentimental. "Move." Marco hesitated, then slid the chair back. He did not stand up. Instead, he shifted, allowing her space to stand beside him. Claire leaned over, her hand hovering over the keyboard. He used the same password for everything that mattered. She murmured. She typed in a phrase. It was not a number or a random string of characters. It was a line from a poem he had read to her on their first anniversary. She hit enter. The screen blinked, and the folder opened. Marco stared at the screen, then slowly looked up at Claire. A flicker of respect crossed his stoic features. "Sit down," Marco said, pulling out the chair next to him. Claire sat. For the next 5 hours, they did not move from the table. They sat shoulder to shoulder, the expensive Italian wool of Marco's suit brushing against the soft cotton of Claire's sleeve. The physical proximity was jarring at first, a constant reminder of the strange, forbidden territory they were navigating. But soon the work consumed them. They sifted through hundreds of files. It was a digital paper trail of a life Marco did not recognize. There were bank records showing Adrian funneling money, vast sums of it, into offshore accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland. There were emails to encrypted addresses that spoke of exit strategies and asset liquidation. He was moving money out of the family accounts, Marco said, his voice low and dangerous. He was skimming from the collections. If anyone else had done this, I would have buried them in the foundation of a new high-rise. He was not stealing it for himself. Claire pointed out, pointing to a subfolder labeled Simply Debt. Look at these transfers. They are payments. He was paying someone off. Marco leaned in closer, his arm pressing warmly against hers as he squinted at the numbers. The heat of his body radiated through his shirt, a steady, furnace-like warmth that Claire found herself leaning into unconsciously. "That is not a payoff," Marco murmured, his mind racing. "That is protection money." He was paying someone to keep a secret, or to keep someone safe. The investigation bled into the late hours of the night. The city lights outside the window turned into a glittering blanket of diamonds against the velvet dark. The bottle of whiskey Marco had opened earlier was half empty, and the tension in the room had shifted from professional focus to a weary, intimate quiet. Marco closed the laptop lid, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked older in the dim light of the dining room chandelier. The armor of the dawn had slipped, revealing the exhausted man beneath. "He always wanted out," Marco said, staring at his own reflection in the darkened window. "Even when we were kids. He hated the noise. He hated the smell of the business." Claire watched him, tracing the sharp line of his jaw with her eyes. "Adrian told me he stayed because he was afraid of you." Marco laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "He stayed because I made it easy for him. When our father died, I took the ring, I took the meetings, I took the blood on my hands. I told Adrian to go to college. I told him to handle the legitimate investments. I took on the legacy so he could live clean." He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes filled with a profound, aching betrayal. And all this time, he was living a double life anyway. He was married. He was skimming money. He was making deals I knew nothing about. I burned my soul to keep him pure. Claire. And he was playing in the dirt the whole time. The pain in his voice was raw, a wound left open to the air. Claire felt a surge of empathy that overwhelmed her caution. She reached out and placed her hand over his. His hand was large, rough-skinned and scarred, a hand that had dealt violence. Hers was small and pale against it. When she touched him, a shock went through Marco, a jolt of electricity that made his breath hitch. He did not pull away. He stared at her hand covering his, anchoring him to the table, to the moment. "He loved you, Marco," Claire said softly. "I know he did. He talked about you constantly. He respected you, but he did not want to be you. And maybe he tried to protect you in his own way, by keeping you out of his mess." Marco turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. The movement was slow, deliberate. He gripped her hand, his thumb brushing against the sensitive skin of her wrist, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse. "He made reckless choices," Marco whispered, "and now he has left me with his mess, and with you." The atmosphere in the room changed. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren were the only sounds. But inside the circle of lamplight, the air grew heavy and charged, the intimacy of shared secrets, of peeling back the layers of Adrian's deception, had woven a bond between them that was terrifyingly strong. Marco looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the fatigue bruising the skin under her eyes, the vulnerability in the curve of her neck, and the strength that held her spine straight even now. She was not just a witness. She was not just a sister-in-law. She was the only person in the world who understood the specific, hollow ache in his chest. He lifted his other hand and reached out. Claire held her breath, watching his fingers approach. He brushed a stray strand of dark hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. His hand lingered there, his rough thumb tracing the high curve of her cheekbone. Claire tilted her head unconsciously into his touch, seeking the warmth, seeking the contact. She'd been so lonely. She had been living in a state of high-alert terror for weeks, and this man, this dangerous, complicated man, was the only solid thing in her universe. Marco leaned in. He moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to slap him, to remind him of who they were. She did not move away. Her breath shivered out of her, a soft, trembling sound that unraveled Marco's restraint. Her eyelids fluttered half shut, her lips parting slightly. Marco closed the distance. Their lips met. It was not a violent kiss. It was not the kiss of a conqueror. It was slow, searching, and devastatingly tender. It was a question asked in the silence. Marco tasted like whiskey and sorrow. Claire tasted like tea and longing. The kiss began tentatively, a testing of boundaries, but the moment their mouths connected, the dam broke. The days of fear, the grief, the adrenaline, the enforced proximity, it all poured into the contact. Marco groaned low in his throat, a sound of surrender. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her steady as he deepened the kiss. He slanted his mouth over hers, demanding more, giving everything. Claire made a small, desperate noise and turned in her chair, her body pressing closer to his. She felt the hard wall of his chest, the heat radiating from him like a furnace. Her hands came up, curling into the crisp fabric of his white dress shirt, bunching the material in her fists as if she were trying to pull him closer than physics allowed. The kiss grew urgent. It became a hunger. Marco's other hand left hers and splayed wide across her waist, his thumb digging into her side, possessive and firm. He drew her toward him, and she went willingly, her body betraying her mind completely. He pulled her gently but firmly until she was sliding off her chair and onto his lap. The movement was fluid, inevitable. Claire straddled his legs, her knees on the leather seat of his chair, her arms wrapping around his neck. She pressed herself against him, feeling the solid, undeniable strength of his body beneath hers. Marco buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent. Vanilla and fear and woman. He kissed the sensitive skin below her ear, his hands roaming over the curve of her back, memorizing the feel of her. For a moment, there was no Adrian. There was no cartel. There was no missing money. There was only this fire. This living, breathing woman who made him feel something other than cold duty for the first time in years. His hand slid lower, gripping her hip, pulling her flush against him. The friction sent a spike of desire through him so sharp it was painful. Then, reality crashed back in. The realization of who she was, who she belonged to, hit Marco like a bucket of ice water. He froze. His hands stilled on her waist. He pulled his face back, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged and harsh in the quiet room. "Claire," he whispered. He said her name like a warning, like a plea. Claire blinked, her eyes hazy with passion. Then she seemed to wake up. She felt the heavy platinum ring on the chain around her neck pressing between their chests. The cold metal burned against her skin like a brand. She scrambled backward, sliding off his lap and stumbling a few feet away. She brought her hand up to her throat, clutching the ring, her chest heaving. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marco remained in the chair, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly the leather creaked. His jaw was clenched, a muscle feathering wildly in his cheek. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a turbulence that matched her own. Claire stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of confusion and guilt. "I do not understand," she stammered, shaking her head. "I miss him. I love him. I am mourning him. But—" She looked at Marco, at his mouth, at his hands. "But I feel like I am betraying him," she confessed, her voice cracking. "And the worst part is, I wanted that. I wanted you to not stop. How can I be so terrible?" Marco stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that shattered the intimacy. He adjusted his jacket, buttoning it with hands that were not quite steady. "You are not terrible," Marco said gruffly. "You are alive, and you are scared, and so am I." He looked at her one last time, his expression a mixture of regret and a longing he could not extinguish. "I am sorry, Claire. It will not happen again. We are both tired. Go to bed." He turned and walked out of the dining room, retreating to the sanctuary of his home office. The door clicked shut, the sound final and absolute. Claire was left standing alone in the dim light of the living room. Her heart was racing a mile a minute, her lips were still tingling from the pressure of his mouth, and her body hummed with a lingering electricity. She clutched Adrian's ring, feeling the sharp edges of the engraving, but the guilt was warring with a truth she could not suppress. in that kiss, in the circle of Marco's arms, she had felt more seen, more protected, and more alive than she had in months, and that terrified her more than any gunman ever could. 5 miles away, in the shadow of a rusted overpass near the docks, the rain had started again. A black SUV idled in the darkness, its headlights off. A man in a hooded sweatshirt stepped out of the gloom. He wore a heavy coat against the chill, and on his finger was a silver ring bearing the crest of the DeLuca family, a soldier, sworn to loyalty. He approached the passenger window of the SUV. The glass rolled down just an inch. The soldier glanced around nervously, checking the empty street. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive. He slipped it through the crack in the window. "The boss has her at the penthouse," the soldier murmured. "She's helping him with the books. They are getting close. And it looks like they are getting close in other ways, too." A hand reached out from the car, a hand with a snake tattoo winding around the wrist, and took the drive. "Good," a voice from inside the car said, a voice that belonged to the Santoro payroll. "Sentiment makes a man weak. Marco DeLuca is about to make a mistake, and we will be there to catch him when he falls." The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away, disappearing into the rainy night, carrying the seeds of a betrayal that would burn Marco's world to the ground. The digital file arrived at noon on a secure server, delivered by a detective on the police force, whose gambling debts Marco DeLuca had purchased 3 years ago. The file was labeled simply with a date, the day Adrian DeLuca had vanished. Marco sat in his home office, the blinds drawn against the harsh midday sun that baked the glass walls of the penthouse. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, taken from a security camera mounted above the entrance of a motel on the outskirts of Graybridge, a place known for hourly rates and questions that were never asked. On the screen, a car pulled up, a man stepped out. Marco froze, the air in his lungs turning to ice. It was Adrian. He was not bound, he was not bleeding. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, but the way he walked, a distinct, slightly loping stride, was unmistakable. Adrian walked to the door of room 9. He paused, looking over his shoulder, his face captured clearly for a split second. He looked nervous. Yes, but he did not look like a captive. The door opened, and a man stepped out to greet him. Marco recognized him instantly. It was Enzo Moretti, a known fixer for the Santoro cartel, a man who specialized in making problems and people disappear. Marco leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. In the video, Adrian raised his left hand to run it through his hair. The platinum band was there, glinting in the cheap motel lights. The 2 men went inside. The timestamp on the video fast-forwarded 1 hour. The door opened again. Adrian walked out alone. He stopped by the vending machine, shaking his hands out as if relieving tension. He raised his left hand again to check his watch. The ring was gone. Marco rewound the footage. He played it again. He watched the hand go up with the ring. He watched the hand come down without it. He sat back in his leather chair, the silence of the room deafening. The narrative Marco had built in his head, that Adrian was a victim, a martyr, a pawn, shattered into jagged pieces. Adrian had not been kidnapped. He had walked into a room with the enemy and paid them with his wedding ring. Marco stood up, the chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He grabbed the tablet and marched into the living room. Claire was standing by the window, staring out at the city she was no longer part of. She turned as he entered, her face brightening tentatively when she saw him, a remnant of the intimacy shared the night before. Marco did not smile back. He placed the tablet on the coffee table with a heavy thud. "Watch it," Marco said. His voice was devoid of warmth. It was the voice of the dawn. Claire frowned, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She picked up the tablet. Marco watched her face as the video played. He saw the confusion, then the shock, and finally, the crushing blow of recognition. "That is him," Claire whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "He is alive! Keep watching," Marco commanded. She watched the exit. She saw the bare hand. "He gave it to them," Marco said, his voice rising. "He walked in with the ring, and he walked out without it. He bought his safety with the symbol of your marriage." "Claire," He traded you." "No," Claire said, shaking her head violently. She dropped the tablet onto the cushion next to her as if it had burned her. "That is not what happened. You do not know that. Maybe they took it from him. Maybe he was forced." "He walked in alone," Marco roared, the anger finally snapping the leash of his control. "Look at him." "Claire, does he look like a man with a gun to his back? He's meeting with Enzo Moretti. Do you know who that is? That is the man the Santoros call when they want to bury a body or broker a treason." Claire stood up, her own temper flaring to match his. She stepped toward him, refusing to be cowed by his size or his rage. "You see everything through blood and betrayal," she shouted, "because that is your world. Marco, you think everyone is playing an angle because you are always playing one. Maybe he was buying time. Maybe he was trying to save me. Save you?" Marco stepped into her space, looming over her. "By giving your token to a Santoro fixer? By disappearing for weeks while you were hunted? He left you exposed. Claire, he left you to be snatched by my men. If I had been anyone else, if I had not seen that ring on the floor, you would be dead right now. And where is he? Is he looking for you?" "No, he is making deals in motel rooms." Claire flinched, the truth of his words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit, but she held her ground, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "He was afraid of you," Claire screamed, tears springing to her eyes. "He was terrified that you would drag him down. And look at us now. Marco, I am locked in your tower, surrounded by your guards. Maybe he was right. Maybe you are the danger." The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and toxic. Marco stared at her, his chest heaving. The hurt in his eyes was profound, a raw wound that he quickly covered with a sneer. "I am the only reason you are breathing," Marco said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You cling to this fantasy of Adrian, because the truth is too pathetic to bear. You fell in love with a liar, and now you are defending him to the man who is cleaning up his mess." Claire let out a sob, a broken, jagged sound. She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as the fight drained out of her. "I feel so foolish," she confessed, her voice cracking. "I feel so stupid. I have spent every night praying for him. I have worried myself sick. And he looks fine." She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I do not know who I am mourning anymore." She wept. "I do not know if I am crying for the man Adrian was, or the man I thought he was. I feel abandoned. Marco, I feel completely alone." The sight of her crumbling broke something in Marco. The anger that had been propelling him evaporated, leaving behind only the heavy, aching exhaustion he had been carrying for weeks. He looked at her, small, shaking, and devastated by the same man who had broken Marco's heart in an impulsive, unguarded moment. Marco crossed the space between them. He did not think about the consequences. He did not think about the ring on the table or the war outside. He sat down next to her and pulled her into his arms. Claire stiffened at first, her muscles locking up in resistance. She pushed against his chest, a weak protest against the confusion of her own heart. But Marco did not let go. He held her firmly, his arms a solid cage of warmth against the cold reality of the video. Marco murmured into her hair, "You are not alone." Claire's resistance shattered. She collapsed against his chest, gripping his lapels as the tears came in a torrent. She cried for the lie of her marriage, for the fear of the last month, and for the terrifying realization that the man holding her, the man she was supposed to hate, was the only one who had never lied to her. Marco cradled the back of her head, his large hand stroking her hair. He rested his chin on the top of her head, closing his eyes. "You did not deserve any of this," Marco whispered. "You deserve the fairy tale he promised you. You deserved better than the DeLucas." They sat like that for a long time, the only sound in the penthouse, the soft hum of the air conditioning and Claire's quiet weeping. Slowly, the tears subsided. The desperate shaking of her shoulders stilled. The comfort began to shift. It was subtle at first, a change in the way their bodies fit together. Claire became aware of the steady, powerful beat of Marco's heart against her ear. She felt the heat of his thighs against hers. The scent of him, sandalwood, starch, and the faint metallic tang of the city filled her senses, grounding her in the present. Marco felt it too. He felt the softness of her curves against his hard lines. He felt her breath hitching, no longer from sobs, but from a different kind of tension. Claire pulled back slightly, creating just enough space to look up at him. Her face was tear-stained, her eyes red-rimmed and vulnerable. She looked at him with a raw openness that took his breath away. Marco lifted his hand, gently, reverently. He used his thumb to wipe a stray tear from her cheek. His skin was rough against hers, a contrast that made her shiver. His gaze dropped to her lips. It was an instinctive movement, a betrayal of his own desire. He looked at her mouth, then forced his eyes back up to hers. The question was there in the dark depths of his pupils. Is this what you want? Is this real? Claire stopped breathing. The video on the table, the husband in the motel, the danger outside, it all faded into background noise. All that existed was Marco, the man who had saved her, the man who had stayed. She made the choice. Claire closed the distance. She surged up, pressing her mouth to his with a raw, desperate hunger. It was not a tentative first kiss like the night before. It was a claiming. It was a demand to be made to feel something other than grief. Marco froze for a fraction of a second, stunned by her intensity, and then he broke. He groaned, a low rumble in his chest, and responded fully. One of his hands tangled in the hair at the nape of her neck, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss. The other hand swept down to the small of her back, pressing her flush against him. He stood up, pulling her with him. They stumbled, their coordination lost to the haze of passion. Marco walked her backward, away from the living room, away from the evidence of Adrian's betrayal. They moved down the hallway, bumping into the wall, their mouths never separating. Marco kicked the bedroom door open and then kicked it shut behind them, sealing out the world. In the dim light of the bedroom, the atmosphere changed. The desperation slowed into something heavier, deeper. Marco pulled away just enough to look at her. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs tracing her jawline. "Claire," he whispered. "Marco," she breathed back. He kissed her again, slower this time. He kissed the corner of her mouth, her jaw, the sensitive hollow of her throat. His hands moved over her, not with the greed of a boy, but with the reverence of a man who knows the value of what he is holding. He mapped the curve of her shoulders, the line of her spine, the softness of her waist. Claire's hands explored him in return. She pushed the jacket off his shoulders, her fingers tracing the muscles of his arms through his shirt. She needed to feel the reality of him. She needed the weight of him to anchor her to the earth. They moved to the bed. The physical act that followed was not just about pleasure. It was a conversation they could not have with words. It was an unraveling of the tension that had bound them together since the moment he ripped the tape from her mouth. It was whispers in the dark, apologies for the pain, murmurs of her name like a prayer. It was the friction of skin on skin, the warmth of bodies tangling together under the high thread count sheets. It was an emotional pouring out, a seeking of solace in the only place they could find it, in each other. For an hour, there was no mafia. There was no missing brother. There was only the sound of their breathing and the feeling of being found. Afterward. The room was quiet. The city lights from the window cast long, pale rectangles across the bedspread. They lay side by side, the sheets tangled around their legs. Marco was on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes, his chest rising and falling with a slow, heavy rhythm. Claire was propped up on one elbow, looking at him. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and traced a jagged white scar that ran across his pectoral muscle, just above his heart. It was an old wound, healed but permanent. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Marco lowered his arm, looking at her. His eyes were dark, unguarded in a way she had never seen. "A knife fight," he said quietly. "When I was 20. I stepped in front of a blade meant for Adrian." Claire's hand stilled on his chest. The reminder of Adrian was a physical weight in the room. The guilt rushed back in, but it was different now. It was sharper, but also more distant. "I am scared," Claire confessed, her voice shaking. Marco turned on his side, facing her. He reached out and tucked the sheet around her shoulder, a gesture of fierce protectiveness. "Of me?" he asked. "No," Claire said, "of this. Of what I feel for you." She looked down at his hand resting on the white sheet. "My memories of Adrian. They feel like a movie I watched a long time ago. But this, you? This feels real. It feels present. And that scares me because I do not know how I can love a ghost and want his brother at the same time." Marco was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, memorizing the curve of her face in the half-light. He felt a gnawing sense of dread in his stomach. They had crossed a line. There was no going back from this. If Adrian was dead, this was a tragedy. If Adrian was alive, this was a war. "I have not let anyone close to me in 10 years, Marco admitted, his voice rough. "I built walls so high I forgot what the ground looked like." He moved his hand to cover hers, pressing it against his chest so she could feel the steady thud of his heart. "If anyone finds out about this," Marco said, the steel creeping back into his tone, "it could destroy everything. The family would see it as a betrayal of blood. The enemies would see it as a weakness, especially if Adrian is alive." Claire finished for him. Marco nodded slowly. "Especially then." The air in the room grew heavy with the unspoken reality of their situation. They were two people clinging to a raft in the middle of a hurricane, and the eye of the storm was passing. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the harsh buzzing of Marco's phone on the nightstand. The sound was jarring, violent in the quiet intimacy of the room. Marco tensed, the lever vanishing and the dawn returning in the blink of an eye. He sat up, the sheet falling to his waist, and grabbed the phone. He looked at the screen. It was Rocco. Marco answered, his voice devoid of sleep or softness. "Talk to me, boss." Rocco's voice came through tinny and urgent. "We got a lead on the motel meet. I squeezed the motel clerk. He said the guy in the cap, Adrian, he asked for directions to the old freight yards." "The freight yards?" Marco asked, frowning. "That is federal land. I know," Rocco said. "I made a call to my contact at the bureau. There is an off-book meeting scheduled there tonight at midnight. Agent Miller is meeting an informant." Marco felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was 11:30. "He's meeting a Fed?" Marco asked, his voice deadly quiet. "It looks that way," Rocco confirmed. "And boss, the intel says the informant is bringing proof to trade for witness protection." Marco hung up the phone. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, his back to Claire. He felt cold, colder than he had ever felt in his life. "What is it?" Claire asked, sitting up, pulling the sheet with her. "Marco?" Marco stood up and began to dress. He pulled on his trousers, his shirt, his movements sharp and mechanical. He strapped his shoulder holster back on, covering the scar she had just traced. "Get dressed," Marco said. "Where are we going?" Claire asked, fear creeping back into her voice. Marco turned to look at her. His eyes were hard, but deep within them, there was a flicker of profound pain. "We are going to the freight yards," Marco said. "Adrian is meeting a federal agent tonight. He picked up his jacket and checked the load in his weapon. My brother was not just paying off the Santoros. Claire. He has been working as an informant. He is a rat. And tonight, we are going to ask him why." The drive to the freight yards was a study in suffocating silence. The rain had returned to Graybridge, a relentless driving downpour that turned the streets into rivers of oil and reflection. Marco drove the black SUV with a terrifying calm, his hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel, though his knuckles were white with tension. Beside him, Claire stared out at the blurring city, her reflection in the glass looking ghostly and fractured. The air inside the car was thick, charged with a nervous energy that was almost painful. It was a cocktail of dread for what they were about to find and the lingering, electric memory of what had happened in the penthouse bedroom only an hour ago. Every time Marco shifted gears, His hand brushed against the fabric of her jeans or the edge of the center console near her arm. Each accidental touch sent a jolt through them both, a reminder of the line they had crossed and the intimacy that now lay between them like a live wire. Neither of them dared to speak about it, to acknowledge the passion, the vulnerability, and the desperate connection they had shared would be to admit that everything had changed. And right now, as they sped toward a confrontation that could end in death, change was a dangerous distraction. Marco turned the car off the main road, the tires crunching over gravel and broken glass as they entered the industrial district. The freight yards were a graveyard of commerce, a sprawling labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, abandoned train cars, and towering cranes that loomed like skeletal sentinels against the storm-darkened sky. "We walk from here," Marco said, killing the engine. His voice was low, stripping away the lever and reinstating the soldier. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a Kevlar vest. He held it out to Claire. "Put this on," he ordered. Claire looked at the heavy black fabric. "Marco, I do not need—" "Put it on." "Claire," he cut her off, his eyes hard, "or you stay in the car." She took the vest, her fingers brushing his. The contact lingered for a fraction of a second too long before she pulled away. She fastened the Velcro straps over her chest, the weight of it oppressive, a physical reminder of the world she had been dragged into. They moved into the yard, sticking to the shadows. Marco moved with a predatory grace, his gun drawn and held low against his thigh. He kept his body angled in front of hers, shielding her from the open spaces. Claire followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her boots slipping on the wet mud. They reached a stack of rusted red shipping containers that formed a makeshift canyon. Marco held up a hand, signaling her to stop. He pressed a finger to his lips and pointed ahead. Claire peered around the edge of the metal. 50 yards away, in a clearing illuminated by the headlights of 2 parked sedans, stood 3 men. The rain fell in sheets, but there was no mistaking the figure in the center. He wore a dark windbreaker and a baseball cap, his shoulders hunched against the cold. It was Adrian. Claire felt the breath leave her lungs in a sharp gasp. Seeing him alive, breathing, and standing there was a shock that rocked her to her core. For weeks, she had mourned him. She had imagined him lying in a ditch, a victim of his brother's world. Seeing him now, looking whole and unharmed, brought a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. But the relief crashed instantly into a wall of confusion and anger. He was not bound. He was not being held at gunpoint. He was standing in a casual triangle with 2 other men. One was a man in a cheap gray suit, Agent Miller, the federal contact Rocco had identified. The other was a man with a distinct neck tattoo and a slick, predatory stance, a lieutenant for the Santoro cartel. Marco stiffened beside her. His worst fear had just solidified into reality. His brother, the boy he had protected, the man he had practically raised, was standing in the rain negotiating with the 2 forces that wanted to destroy the DeLuca family. Adrian was not a victim. He was a player, and he was playing a dangerous game on all sides. Claire gripped Marco's arm, her fingers digging into the wet fabric of his jacket. She needed an anchor. She watched as the federal agent gestured angrily, shouting over the sound of the rain. "You promised us the ledger, Adrian," the agent yelled. "The deal was the ledger and the testimony." "I need more time," Adrian shouted back, his voice carrying on the wind. "Marco is locking everything down. He suspects something." "We are done waiting," the Santoro lieutenant cut in, his voice smoother, darker. "We held up our end. We grabbed the girl. We put the pressure on, but your brother is still standing." Claire felt her blood run cold. She watched Adrian run a hand over his face, a gesture of frustration she knew well. "The girl was supposed to be the breaker," Adrian argued, stepping toward the Santoro man. "You were supposed to use her to force Marco to make a mistake, to make him reckless. If he killed one of your men to get her back, the feds would have him on a murder charge. She's just collateral leverage. Adrian," the agent spat. "And right now, she is useless because Marco has her tucked away in his tower. Collateral leverage." The words hung in the damp air, sharp as a knife. Claire felt as if she had been slapped. She looked at the man she had married, the man who had promised her a life of peace, and saw a stranger. He wasn't talking about her like a husband talks about a wife. He was talking about her like a poker chip, a tool to be used and discarded to get what he wanted. Beside her. Marco went unnaturally still. The realization burned through him like acid. Adrian had not just sold her out. He had orchestrated the kidnapping. He had placed the ring. He had set Claire up as bait to lure Marco into a trap that would send him to prison for life. Adrian wanted Marco gone, and he had been willing to sacrifice Claire's safety and her soul to do it. Marco raised his weapon, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He was calculating the distance, the wind, the angle. He could end it. He could end the betrayal right here, but he didn't fire. He just watched, his heart breaking in silence. Suddenly, the dynamic in the clearing shifted. A third vehicle roared into the yard, its high beams blindingly bright, cutting through the darkness. It was a heavy-duty truck, and it did not slow down. "Who is that?" Adrian yelled. Spinning around, the Santoro lieutenant looked confused. Reaching for his waistband, "That is not my crew." The truck screeched to a halt and the back doors flew open. 4 men poured out, carrying automatic rifles. They were not feds. They were not DeLuca men. They were a rival faction of the Santoro cartel. Hired guns sent to clean up the mess and eliminate all loose ends. "It is a double cross," Marco shouted, his voice ripping through the noise of the storm. Gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening, a chaotic staccato that echoed off the metal containers. In the clearing, the federal agent went down immediately, his chest blooming red. The Santoro lieutenant scrambled for cover behind his sedan, returning fire blindly. Adrian stood frozen in the center of the chaos, looking wildly from the gunman to the fallen agent. "Get down!" Marco roared. He didn't yell it at Adrian, he yelled it at Claire. He yanked her back just as a spray of bullets stitched a line of holes across the shipping container where they had been standing. Metal sparked and screamed. Marco threw his body over hers, shoving her toward the gap between 2 containers. "Move," Marco commanded. He spun around, raising his handgun, and fired 2 precise shots. One of the gunmen dropped. Marco didn't wait to check his work. He grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her deeper into the maze of the freight yard. The yard descended into madness. The Santoro hit squad was advancing, suppressing the area with heavy fire. Adrian had scrambled behind the wheel well of the federal agent's car, clutching a small pistol he had pulled from his waistband, looking terrified and out of his depth. Marco moved Claire from cover to cover, his focus divided. He was a creature of war now. He checked corners. He counted rounds, he assessed threats, but his primary mission was the woman gripping his hand. He shielded her with his body at every turn, his muscles coiled and ready to take a bullet meant for her. "Marco!" Claire screamed as a bullet ricocheted off a steel beam inches from her face. "Keep moving," he barked, shoving her behind the rusted hulk of a forklift. In the confusion, they found themselves pinned down behind a battered flatbed truck. The gunmen were closing in, flanking them. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the other side of the truck. "Marco?" Marco looked over the hood. Adrian was there, crouching in the mud, his face pale and streaked with rain. He looked at Marco, then at Claire. His eyes widened in shock. "Claire?" Adrian gasped. "What are you doing here?" Marco leveled his gun at his brother. "You tell me." "Adrian," Marco shouted over the roar of gunfire. "Is this part of the plan? Is this the witness protection you bought with your wife's life?" Adrian flinched, guilt and misery flashing across his face. He looked at Claire, who was staring at him with a mixture of horror and heartbreak. "I can still fix this," Adrian yelled, his voice cracking. "I did not know they were going to send a hit squad. I just wanted to end it." "Marco, end what?" Claire screamed, stepping out from behind Marco's shoulder, ignoring his attempt to pull her back. "Our marriage? My life? I did it for you," Adrian shouted back, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I did it to get you out. I wanted to get you away from him, away from the blood." He pointed his gun accusingly at Marco. "He is a monster, Claire. Look at him. He destroys everything he touches. I had to get you out from under his shadow. I made a deal to put him away so we could be free." Marco laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You made a deal with the devil, little brother, and now the devil is here to collect." The two brothers stood 10 feet apart, guns trained on each other's chests, while the battle raged around them. It was a tableau of tragedy, the family bond severed by secrets and lies. Claire stepped between them. "Stop it," she screamed, throwing her arms out. "Both of you, stop it! Claire, get down!" Marco yelled, trying to reach for her. "Adrian, put the gun down," Claire pleaded, turning to her husband. "You lied to me. You let me believe you were dead. You let me be taken. I had to," Adrian insisted, his hand shaking. "It was the only way to make the feds believe Marco was a threat to you. It was the only way to get the leverage." "I am not leverage," Claire cried, her voice breaking. "I am your wife, or I was. But right now, the only person who has tried to keep me alive is him." She pointed at Marco. The realization hit Adrian hard. He looked at Claire, seeing the way she stood near Marco, the way Marco's body was angled to protect her even now, with a gun pointed at his own brother. He saw the bond that had formed between them, the undeniable connection that he had inadvertently created. Adrian lowered his gun slightly. "I just wanted to be the hero for once," he whispered. "I just wanted to be the one who saved you." "You are not a hero." "Adrian," Marco said, his voice heavy with grief, "you are just a man who got lost." Suddenly, Marco's eyes caught a glint of movement on top of a crane tower overlooking the yard. A flash of lightning illuminated the silhouette of a sniper. Taking aim at the group exposed behind the truck, the barrel was pointed directly at Adrian. Marco did not think. He did not calculate the betrayal. He did not weigh the anger. He simply moved. Adrian. Marco lunged forward, shoving his brother hard to the side. The sniper's rifle cracked. Marco jerked violently as the bullet, meant for Adrian's heart, grazed his upper arm, tearing through the expensive suit jacket and the flesh beneath. He stumbled, falling to one knee in the mud. "Marco!" Claire shrieked, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands instantly searching for the wound. Adrian, sprawled in the mud where Marco had shoved him, looked up at the crane. He saw the sniper cycling the bolt for a second shot. Adrian raised his pistol. For the first time in his life, his hand was steady. He wasn't thinking about deals or leverage. He was thinking about the brother who had just taken a bullet for him, despite everything. Adrian fired 3 rapid shots. The sniper on the crane jerked backward, his rifle falling from his hands as he tumbled from the high perch, disappearing into the dark. Adrian scrambled over to Marco and Claire. "You are hit," Adrian said, his voice trembling. "It is a scratch," Marco gritted out, though his face was pale with pain. He looked at Adrian, his eyes searching. "Why did you shoot him? You could have let him finish me. You would have been free." Adrian looked at the wound on Marco's arm, then at Claire's terrified face. He holstered his gun. "Because you are my brother," Adrian whispered, "and I think I've been wrong about everything." In the distance, the wail of sirens began to rise, piercing through the storm. The Santoro hit squad, hearing the approach of the police, began to fall back. "Their job botched. They are coming," Marco said, struggling to his feet with Claire's help. "The police and the rest of the cartel. We have to go," Adrian said. "There is a way out through the north gate." Marco looked at Adrian, then at Claire. The triangle was complete again, but the geometry had changed forever. "Lead the way," Marco said. Together, the 3 of them ran into the darkness, united by blood and bullets, moving toward a final showdown that none of them could escape. The wail of sirens cut through the storm like a physical blade, forcing the Santoro gunmen to scatter into the shadows of the freight yard. They were predators who thrived in the dark. But the approaching blue and red lights were a disinfectant they could not withstand. Marco, Claire, and Adrian ran. They splashed through the mud, their breath tearing at their lungs, heading toward the only structure that offered cover, a massive, derelict warehouse looming at the edge of the property. Marco kicked the side door open, and they stumbled inside. The space was cavernous, smelling of wet concrete, rust and old oil. High above, a single bank of industrial lights flickered and buzzed, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the floor. The eerie familiarity of the setting hit Marco instantly. It was almost identical to the warehouse where this nightmare had begun, where he had ripped the tape from Claire's mouth and found the ring. The story had come full circle. Marco staggered against a wooden crate, his legs threatening to give way. The bullet wound in his shoulder was burning with a white-hot intensity, and blood was soaking through the sleeve of his ruined jacket. He pressed his hand against the injury, his face pale and slick with sweat and rain. "We are safe for a moment," Adrian gasped, leaning against a rusted pillar, his chest heaving. "The police will sweep the yard first. We have 5 minutes before they breach this building." Marco looked at his brother. The anger that had been simmering in his gut boiled over, overriding the pain in his arm. "Safe," Marco spat, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "You call this safe? You orchestrated a war? Adrian, you turned my life into a battlefield and your wife into a target." Claire stood between them, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked from Marco, bleeding and furious, to Adrian, who looked desperate and small in the flickering light. "Why?" Claire demanded, her voice trembling but loud. "Tell me the truth." "Adrian, no more lies. The ring. How did it get on the floor that night? You said you lost it to the Santoros." Adrian looked at her, his expression crumbling. He slid down the pillar until he was sitting on the grime-covered floor, looking like a child who had broken something he could not fix. "I did not lose it," Adrian confessed, his voice hollow. "I planted it." Marco froze. Claire took a step back, her hand flying to her throat where the ring still hung on its chain. "What?" Marco asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "When the Santoros grabbed her—" "I was watching," Adrian said, staring at the floor. "It was part of the deal, but I knew they were unstable. I knew they might kill her just to send a message. So I slipped the ring into her pocket before they shoved her into the van." He looked up at Marco, tears streaming down his face. "I knew you would find her. Marco, you always clean up the mess, and I knew that if you found her, and you saw that ring, you would pause. You would not kill her. You would protect her because you would think she was connected to me. It was a signal. Marco, it was the only way I could ensure she survived the chaos I started." Marco stared at him, stunned by the twisted logic. "You planted it as a failsafe? You let her be kidnapped. You let her be terrified, hoping that my loyalty to you would save her from the wolves you invited to dinner?" "I was trying to save everyone," Adrian shouted, standing up. "I wanted to use the leverage to get the feds to dismantle your empire. I wanted the Santoros to pressure you. I thought if the business was gone, if you were in prison or gone, then Claire and I could finally be free." Claire walked over to him. She moved slowly, like she was approaching a stranger. "So that is it," she said, her voice cracking with heartbreak. "I was leverage. You planned to run away with me, but only after you burned everything else down. Was I ever a person to you, Adrian? Or was I just the final piece on your chessboard?" "I love you," Adrian insisted, reaching for her hands. Claire flinched and pulled away. "Everything I did was for you. I wanted to give you a life without fear. You gave me nothing but fear," Claire cried. "You disappeared. You let me think you were dead. You let me be tied to a chair in a warehouse while men discussed how to dispose of me, and the only reason I am standing here is because of him." She pointed at Marco. Marco, who stood bleeding against the crate. Marco, who had hunted for the truth while Adrian hid in motels. Adrian looked at Marco, then back at Claire. He saw the way her body angled toward his brother. He saw the look in her eyes, a look of trust that he had squandered. "I thought," Adrian stammered, "I thought she would be safer if your empire fell. Marco, even if it meant you had to fall with it, it was the only future I could see." Marco laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You wanted to be the savior and the puppet master at the same time. Adrian, but you do not have the hands for it. You dropped the strings, and now we are all tangled in them." Claire looked at Adrian, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I love the man I thought you were, Adrian, but that man never existed. I cannot forgive this. I cannot forgive the lies." Her gaze drifted to Marco. He was looking at her, his dark eyes filled with pain and a fierce, steady resolve in the chaos, in the violence. He was the only thing that felt true. Before Adrian could respond, the metal doors at the far end of the warehouse burst open with a deafening crash. The Santoro hit squad had bypassed the police line. They were here to finish the job. 4 men in tactical gear poured into the space. Weapons raised. They did not shout warnings. They simply opened fire. "Down!" Marco roared. He tackled Claire, shoving her behind a stack of steel pallets. Adrian dove behind a forklift as bullets chewed up the concrete floor where they had been standing seconds before. The warehouse erupted into a war zone. The noise was deafening. The sharp crack of automatic rifles, the ping of ricochets, the shattering of glass high above. Marco pulled his handgun. He checked the magazine. 3 rounds left. He looked across the gap at Adrian. Adrian was clutching his pistol, looking terrified. Marco caught his eye. He nodded once. A silent command. "Move with me." Adrian nodded back. The fear in his eyes hardened into resolve. Despite the betrayal, despite the lies, they were still brothers. They had grown up in the same violent house. They had learned to survive the same way. "On 3, Marco shouted over the gunfire. 1, 2, 3. They moved in perfect sync, a rhythm born of blood and shared history. Marco popped up from the left, firing 2 controlled shots that dropped the lead gunman. Adrian broke cover from the right, providing suppression fire that forced the other 3 to scramble for cover. They advanced, moving from crate to crate, covering each other's blind spots. It was a dance of death, executed with a tragic, beautiful precision. For a moment, the resentment vanished. They were just Marco and Adrian, fighting back-to-back against the world. Marco reached a heavy industrial shelving unit. He grabbed Claire's hand, pulling her along with him. "Stay low," he ordered. "We are almost to the exit." They were 20 feet from the back door. Freedom was right there. But the Santoros were desperate. One of the gunmen, wounded and bleeding, rose from behind a pile of debris. He raised a shotgun, aiming not at the brothers, but at the woman running between them. Marco saw the movement. He turned, raising his weapon, but he was out of ammunition. The slide clicked empty. "No!" Marco screamed, throwing his body toward Claire to shield her, but he was too far away. Adrian was closer. Adrian didn't think. He didn't calculate. He didn't weigh the leverage. He simply looked at the woman he had failed and the brother he had betrayed, and he made his choice. Adrian threw himself into the line of fire. The shotgun roared. The impact lifted Adrian off his feet. He was thrown backward, crashing into Marco and Claire, knocking them both to the ground. Silence seemed to descend on the warehouse, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the ringing in Marco's ears. The gunman racked the slide for another shot, but before he could fire, the main doors were breached by a SWAT team. Police floodlights blinded the room. Commands to drop weapons echoed off the walls. The Santoro gunman dropped his weapon and raised his hands. It was over. Marco scrambled to his knees. He grabbed Adrian by the shoulders and pulled him into his lap. "Adrian," Marco yelled, his voice cracking. "Stay with me." Adrian's chest was a ruin. His breath was coming in wet, ragged gasps. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. He looked up at Marco, his eyes unfocused. "Marco." Adrian whispered. "I am here," Marco said, pressing his hand over the wound, trying desperately to staunch the flow. "I am here. The ambulance is coming. Just hold on." Adrian shook his head weakly. He reached out, his blood-stained hand gripping Marco's lapel. "Get her out," Adrian rasped. "Take her. Out of this life. Do what I never could." He looked at Claire, who was kneeling beside him, sobbing, holding his other hand. "I'm sorry," Adrian whispered to her. Then he looked back at Marco. "Walk away, brother, walk away." From the blood. Adrian's hand went slack. His eyes drifted shut. "Adrian," Marco screamed, shaking him. "No, no." Medics swarmed the scene. Hands pulled Marco away. He fought them, roaring with grief, until he felt Claire's arms around his waist, holding him back, grounding him. He watched as they loaded Adrian onto a stretcher. He watched the frantic work of the paramedics. He watched the ambulance doors close, hiding the fate of his brother behind a wall of steel and flashing lights. Marco stood in the rain outside the warehouse, his arm bleeding. His heart shattered. Claire stood beside him, her head resting against his uninjured shoulder. Whether Adrian lived or died was in the hands of fate now. But the choice he had made in the end, the sacrifice, gave Marco a sliver of peace. In his final moment, Adrian had not been a rat. He had not been a coward. He had been a DeLuca. 6 weeks later, the morning air was crisp and cold on the bridge overlooking the Grey Bridge River. The water below was dark, churning with the current, heading out to the indifferent sea. Marco stood by the railing. He wore a simple black coat, no suit, no tie. He looked different, lighter somehow, though the lines of grief were etched permanently into his face. He had spent the last month dismantling the empire. It had been a bloody, difficult process, but he had done it. He had cut ties with the Santoros, sold off the illicit operations, and moved the legitimate businesses to the forefront. He had paid off the corrupt cops and severed the connections to the underworld. He held the platinum ring in his hand. He ran his thumb over the engraving one last time. October 12th. He thought about Adrian. He thought about the boy who read on fire escapes. He thought about the man who had died on a concrete floor to save them. "Rest now, little brother," Marco whispered. He opened his hand. The ring fell. It tumbled end over end, catching the weak morning sunlight for a brief second before it hit the water with a tiny splash and disappeared forever. Marco watched the ripples fade. Then he turned his back on the river and walked away. The apartment was small, located in a quiet suburb 3 towns over. It had large windows that let in the afternoon sun, filling the space with a warm, golden light. It smelled of coffee and fresh paint. Claire stood at the kitchen island, sorting through files. She was working at a community legal clinic now, helping people who had been chewed up by the system. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. The shadows of Greybridge were fading. There was a knock at the door. Claire froze. Old habits died hard. But then she remembered. No one was hunting her anymore. She walked to the door and opened it. Marco stood there. He looked hesitant, standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets. He had traded the Italian suits for jeans and a dark sweater. The scar on his chin was still there, and he still carried himself with the wariness of a soldier, but his eyes were soft. "Can I come in?" he asked. Claire stepped back, opening the door wide. "Always?" He walked in, looking around the small, bright space. It was a far cry from the penthouse. It was real. They stood in the kitchen, the air between them thick with everything they had survived. They talked for hours. They talked honestly, without codes or secrets. They talked about the guilt that still woke them up at night. They talked about the grief that hit them in waves. They talked about Adrian, not as a saint or a villain, but as the man who had brought them together through a tragedy of his own making. "It is strange," Claire said, tracing the rim of her coffee mug, "to be here, to be okay. It takes time," Marco said gently. "We are rebuilding from the ruins." Claire looked up at him. She saw the man who had shielded her with his body, the man who had walked away from a kingdom because a dying man asked him to. "I do not want to do it alone," Claire whispered. Marco stepped closer. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was familiar now, a source of comfort rather than fear. He searched her eyes, looking for permission. "You will never be alone," Marco promised. "Not as long as I'm breathing." Claire nodded, tears shining in her eyes. Marco leaned in. He kissed her. It was not a desperate kiss born of adrenaline. It was slow. It was deep. It was a kiss that tasted of forgiveness and hope. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him. Her fingers slid up to the back of his neck, tangling in his hair, holding him close. The passion was there, quiet and burning, but it was no longer stolen. It was chosen. They broke the kiss, but stayed close, their foreheads resting against each other. Marco turned them so they were facing the window. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. Claire leaned back into him, her hands covering his. They looked out at the city skyline in the distance. It was uncertain. The future was unwritten. They were 2 scarred souls who carried the weight of the past. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. They knew one thing for sure. They had found a way to love each other in the ruins, and that was enough. Author's note: thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey of betrayal, loyalty, and love, and I hope you enjoyed the ride as much as I enjoyed writing it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know which part of the story shocked you the most. Was it the ring, the betrayal, or the ending? If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Mafia Romance Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. I have many more dark, romantic tales waiting for you. Thank you for your support. And until next time.